see whether it's gonna. Okay, so hi Rob, and welcome to Life as a Seer. So
Hi.
I'm obviously in London. You're in Australia. What part of Australia are you in? What side? Because I know.
It's a big place. Yeah, I'm on the East Coast. I'm in the capital city, which is Canberra. Yeah, so it's about 2 hour drive from Sydney, which I think is the city that most people are familiar with.
Most are familiar with like Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth. So when I was working with Australia, I'd call them. I'm like, oh, but it's down the road. They're like, no, it's not. It's like a different time zone. It's just like because everything in the UK is quite close. You know, like you get there and we get Scotland in 5 hours or so. But actually, you could just not pass anything in Australia. So it's quite important to have those. So I'm excited to have you join because we've been chatting on Twitter. I've gone back. I quite like Twitter. I'm not a social media person, but I like Twitter because you can have quite interesting conversations. And one conversation came up was about horary. Now, you're a traditional astrologer. I don't know, is that right to say? You're a traditional astrologer mainly, but you are very much looking at how you meld that into a modern context. Which we all have to do, especially with these very ancient arts. And that's what the podcast is about. Like these are ancient arts that have probably got old texts that you have to change to make it modern. And the conversation came around was, I was kind of going, well, I don't really understand some of the rules with horary. How do they work in today's life? And nowadays, we don't want to ask certain questions. Like we aren't happy to ask things like, should you marry this person that you've not met? Like we don't always want to, which is actually, if you go back to horary, it tended to be a little bit
Yes.
bad. So before we go into that, I'd like to know a little bit more about your perspective on astrology. How do you view it? What lens do you put it through?
Sure. Okay, so yeah, I started studying the subject about 10 years ago, and I was primarily really focused on learning medieval and Renaissance astrology because at the time I had discovered talismanic magic and was really interested in learning how to do the elections to create talismans. What's funny is that through that that opened the door to astrology for me, and then I kind of lost interest in doing talismans, and pretty much focused entirely on this fascinating subject of astrology. So because my purpose was trying to use like medieval manuals for magic, I really didn't want to learn modern astrology because it wouldn't help me to make a talisman, if you know what I mean.
It makes sense because talismans aren't modern. Like a lot of people don't use them, and so it's quite interesting because I think there's a revival in magic now as it stands. So it's quite interesting that you came in through that route.
Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of people are kind of like came into astrology first, and now they're discovering like astrological magic at the end of it, whereas I came in astrological magic at the start, right? And then I'm trying to like understand. I bought like grimoires from the Middle Ages, and I'm trying to understand them.
That's fascinating because I do think there's a slight difference between the direction you came in the way you do astrology. I came in through a mediumship and psychic work, so I came in through that kind of energetic focused, and it is very different when you speak to out and out astrologers who came into astrology first, who might be then discovering more energetic things. So it is very different on the path, and we tend to have a little bit more of a wider remit. Like we tend to want to go, okay, well, this is good, but how do I change that a little bit? How do I add it? Because when you're doing magic, you have to add your own little, obviously you've got the grimoires. I can't believe you went to buy grimoires, but old books are great.
Yeah, I think I got a lot of Saturn in my birth chart, so I think that's where that sort of love and fascination for the old things comes in a bit. So and also because before I even was interested in astrology, I was very interested in history and ancient philosophy. So, a lot of traditional astrology just ticks all the boxes for me because it combines a lot of those loves like history, philosophy, and my sort of growing interest in sort of the occult world. Although I probably wouldn't call myself an occultist nowadays, I'd probably just call myself a traditional astrologer.
It's interesting. I just love, because it's weird that I've connected with lots of people now who, when you get deeper into talking about them, there's so many other things there, and philosophy tends to come out as quite an important part, especially when, I guess it's one part of horary, for instance, that I struggle with, because some of the philosophy around the decisions make, how you read a chart, don't seem to meld as well. So perhaps we maybe take a step back a little bit. So horary itself, and the reason why we were discussing horary is because it's probably, I know there's astrologers as in general have this love-hate with divination, the word divination, and the occult. So you have one camp that are very much, it's science, it's purely science and that. And actually, I do find when you come to divination, that's where it gets even more murky, because they can't say that it's pure out and out science in some ways, because there's another element to it. It always feels closer to where you can't actually say it's pure, it's purely scientific. There is that element of divination for me. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I'd actually agree entirely. It's funny that you asked me to talk about divination or horary in the context of divination, because that's a subject that I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Well, that's good. I didn't know that beforehand, so it's always good.
Yeah. So it's well done, you. But yeah, I'm kind of more of the camp that does think that astrology is either more divination than science, or is pretty much entirely divination. I don't really. Everyone's entitled to their own views on these things, I suppose. But my camp is that astrology is not a science. It has some things that make it look scientific, and you can engage in empirical research with astrology. A lot of people do that. They'll look at thousands of charts, look at particular placements, and
they have these markers for it. Yeah, which I think has exactly got the time. But to me, if it was a pure science, you could measure it accurately, consistently, because that's the whole point. It'd be measured. But because there's too many variables, and people are by nature variables, then we would have had it automated by now. So they'd have some AI robots already doing it, because it can be quite powerful. So when we're talking about I see it more as an art form. So it blends so many things up, and so many people who do astrology are creative, because you're talking about a new language. You're talking about symbolic language, and you have to get did you as a kid read sci-fi or fantasy books? I did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you read that, you have to go into a whole new world. So you spend the first thing, because you have to get used to the language, the world, all of that. So you have to let go of all the things that you know about now to be able to immerse yourself in this other world. That's why you go on for 2, 3, 4 books, and they go on to series. So I feel like astrology is a little bit like that, in the fact that it's its own world and it's creative, and you have to dive in. Not that you have to learn everything new, but you do have to kind of immerse yourself a little bit into it. Whereas, with other things, you don't have to as much. Whereas astrology, it's a symbolic language. You have to kind of try and understand what Saturn is doing in this chart. And it's go from textbook, but it is nicer when you can when you're going with a client, and you can explain how that Saturn is working. And if you can use a story or something else, it really, explain Saturn in human terms. People like it, although people don't like Saturn. Isn't that the same in horary? People don't like.
I think so. I think, it reminds me of a tweet that you made recently. I don't want to turn this into let's discuss our Twitter, but it reminds me of something you said recently, where you said, you sort of were taking issue with the malefic and benefic distinction. And I think the way I talk about Saturn, we call him a malefic because most people, most of the time, don't want that energy in their lives, because we're immature, or we're not, we just don't recognize the benefit of that. So we say, oh, that's bad or evil or something like that. But actually, Saturn is extremely important, function. If you it symbolizes a very important sort of function in the universe, really. We have to have a limit. We have to have.
We are limited in what we can do, and I think that's right. And I think if we go back to the malefic, benefic, because I got on my soapbox, which I don't do very often, but then when I do, I'm on it. I'm on it. And the reason why I think malefic and benefic will probably, do you use those terms in horary? Or because
Look,
I can see where you would use it in like return charts. I can see how you would use it in mundane charts. I could see how you would see it initially in a baby's chart. So I could see all those uses. Not that you would tell the parent that this is malefic planet unless they're astrologer. But I could see how you could use malefic and benefic. I don't think they're wrong. And when you judge a chart, I think when you're judging people, I don't think that you can use those terms when they could have changed it. So that's my issue with it. There was also an issue with gender, because it seems to be a huge thing about the masculine and feminine, and and yin and yang, and it's kind of like, well, it's not gender. It's an energy. It's a process. So it's associated with gender because we used to opt out. But actually, a lot of people are kind of taking, well, Mars is male. Well, actually, it can be male or it can be masculine. It can be someone who's very much with that male energy, but it can still be a woman, in the same way a tarot card with a man on it can be a woman too. It can just be that expression of energy. So do you have, so you don't have that in horror, you don't have malefic and benefic. Do you look at the planets in a detriment way instead?
Yeah, so I mean, we do call them malefic and benefic, I mean, as like a technical term, but I think really in practice, especially with horary, this is getting technical. I wonder whether I should perhaps explain what horary is very briefly before I jump into this.
Just as an overview of what horary is.
Sure. So basically, with what most people are familiar with astrology is you cast a horoscope for the moment that someone's born, and that will give you information about that person. And then you can get into philosophical discussions about how much and what kind of information you get out of it. But basically, that's the premise of most of astrology, is that birth time tells you something about the person. Horary is a little bit different, because you're casting a horoscope not for the time that someone's born, but for the time that a question is put to the astrologer, or the time that the astrologer receives the question, if you're working with email and things like that. And you erect the horoscope, and then basically the idea is that you find an answer to the question in the horoscope. So it's a very specific form of astrology. It's got the chart is for one intended purpose, and then it's done, sort of like a burner phone.
Yeah, it's not, because I do see people trying to repost ones from how many, and it's like, well, if that time zone is gone, that time zone is gone. And I like that, but also it's predictive work, which is quite good. Not always, because obviously, but you are asking, part of it, if even when, maybe let's use an example of some of the questions that you get, because you must get the lost items, you get the will they come back, will I hear from them type of questions, you get the should I questions, which kind of raises a point, because I know that a lot of people now don't really want to do the should I. They want to protect themselves a little bit. So what's your perspective on the should I questions of, like, should I do this? Should I invest here? Should I? Because these were traditionally what was used, horary was used, and it was very much a definitive.
Yeah. I actually think that it's funny, because I was sort of surprised when I found out that there is this school of thought that says that horary should only be used for like yes or no questions, and it shouldn't be used for should I, or like if I do this, what will happen? Those kinds of more like weighing up options type questions. Because like what I've found is that that's the majority of questions that I get is people who are in a quandary and they want some guidance or some like info that helps them make a decision, So by rejecting those kinds of questions, I'd be rejecting most of the questions I get. But the other thing is that just like on a technical level, like, some people will say that, horary is really all about finding that aspect between two planets. And if you find it, then it's a yes. And if you don't find it, then it's a no. And like, that's as far as it goes. But I find it's actually a really just describing a situation and giving you a sense of like the motivations or the interests of the parties involved, and maybe some of the other stuff that's going on around the edges. And you can use that information to give someone something approaching advice. But it is, you're right, there is an issue there where you start to become a guide for someone's life, when I suppose ideally horary should be this sort of objective thing where you get the information, it's fairly,
I don't know. I question the need for it. I think, to me, that's a very, I guess, modern thing. But it's, I think it goes with psychological astrology. It goes in the same way I've seen with tarot and all these other readings. Tarot, especially, if a lot of people now won't do what they see as prediction. They won't. They kind of go. So if someone comes to you and says, "Should I stay with him?" They'll go, "Or should I do that?" You kind of give them. People don't want to say yes or no, and they go out of their way not to, because it's this whole movement that you have everything in your hands, which I kind of find astrology tells you, like, there are limits to certain things. So I kind of, you look at that and you go, well, yeah, you think you can have everything, but actually there are limits to that. So for me, actually getting into certain aspects of, I did started looking a little bit into traditional astrology, and it kind of cemented, and it made me go back to actually that fate and free will argument, but also that I think we all have internally, but also it said, what's wrong with prediction? Because I used to get prediction, and I would get it, especially in a mediumistic way, and it just say yes or no, and it was there. And that is what it is. And so sometimes I think we're afraid of saying it. We're afraid of, laying ourselves on the line by saying, this is what's gonna occur. This is how things are gonna unfold. But actually, isn't that the magic of horary? It's quite not black and white, but it kind of goes, yes, no, this is the reason why. Especially if there's a lot of love horaries, and you're kind of like see all these other planets in the 7th house and their planet in their 7th house. And then it just describes a bit like a tarot reading. It's like, okay, well, we can see they're really just interested in themselves or other people. You can see that quite instantly. So even if you had an aspect, but that's going to form, is it going to be that there's a deeper story between that? So it's interesting what you're talking about, how, the way that people are looking for the information and the way you can use horary to actually kind of break that story down a little bit for them.
Yeah, I agree with. So there's so many interesting things you've said there. I wish I was sort of taking notes so I could respond to all of it. But I do think that, like, yes, like everything I've said just now about like that sort of should I, or if, weighing up options type questions. I still think that in some ways that kind of question is, like, while I take them and I'm happy to take them, I wonder sometimes whether people are asking them in a particular way because they are afraid of a yes/no question. They're afraid of a definitive answer. So they want, a sort of a, should I do this or should I do that? Like, should I, or do you want an example? Or
yeah, no, maybe it'd be quite good to see the examples of some of the type of questions that are coming. And also, do they change in seasons? Like we just had Venus retrograde. In Scorpio, and usually, if it's anything in Scorpio, I think it was last time in 2010, I stopped doing readings around that time, because it wasn't like, will he come back to me? It's like, how do I get him to not go? How do I stop him? And it was really quite visual. So I wondered whether what the questioners usually get, and then what do you find they change in certain times?
That's an interesting question. I haven't actually looked at, like, there's probably a massive oversight on my part to sort of look at the horary questions I'm receiving, compare that with like the astro weather, if you like, and kind of see, there's a correlation there. I haven't really done that work, but that's interesting. I might spend some time doing that. I think it'd be interesting to see
the results of it. But what questions do you usually get? Like what type
most of it's every horary book says this, and you can even just look at the contents page of a horary book, like a textbook, and the thickest chapter is always the 7th house, right?
Yeah, it's always 7th house. It's always 7th house.
That's it, because that's what everyone. I'm questioning whether that is the most important thing in the world for people, but it seems to be on people's minds a lot. Certainly, the 7th and those relationship questions. Will this relationship work out? Should I cut my losses and get out of this now? Does this guy like me, or is he just looking at me because he's a weirdo? Those kinds of questions come up a lot. So that's probably the majority of my work, but I do get my fair share of, like, I've had a couple of interesting lost object horrors recently, and career questions come up a lot. So it's often someone who's applied for a job and can't wait to find out whether they're going to get it or not. So they ask me whether they'll get it or not, which is always funny to me because I thought, well, you can save yourself a bit of money and just wait and you get the answer anyway. But you know.
Yeah, I find that odd with like pregnancy questions as well. It's like, well, you could just go to a doctor because you know, I know that's weird, but it will be like you could go to a doctor, but instead what you're going to do is you're going to, and it's only going to give you that a few days beforehand. So I guess that, so are these very time sensitive ones? Is it something where it's important for people to have a turnaround? Because I think
so. Yeah.
Because I see online with, it's quite interesting. When I was looking at giving readings and a number of years ago when I first started, and I was like, okay, so I started looking around, and it's quite interesting that you get certain ones where turn around in this much, I turn around in that. And I'm assuming that in horror, you might get that need to have it, you know, within a certain, you know, people want to know this now. Will he call me? Yeah. You know, if it's, will he call me is probably because that could happen in the next few days. So they're obviously looking for something that's quite instant.
I think that's right. I think there is like a temporal factor that probably pushes someone to ask a question, whether that's because there's like a external deadline or something looming, or whether there's like an internal deadline, if you like I can't sit here, I can't get sleep until I have at least some inkling of what might happen. So those are the kind of questions I get the majority of. I think I just want to go back to something you said earlier about how you use the malefic planets in horary. I mean, I hesitate to even call them that, because in horary you're really, how do I put this? It's one of my favorite astrologers, John Frawley, writes about horary very eloquently, and he puts it like this: that even though like Saturn is technically like a malefic, you know, he does what role he is given. Like horror is almost like a play, and whatever houses Saturn and Mars rule, well, that's their roles they're given in the play, right? So if Capricorn is rising, well, that means you're signified by Saturn, whether you're a particularly Saturnine person or not. Like you might be the most like, you know, lovely Libra kind of, you know, throwing flowers to everyone and dancing and singing, but for this particular chart, you're Saturn, you know? And so Saturn doesn't necessarily carry a lot of that Saturn baggage, if you like, in horary that he does in natal, because with natal, you're paying a lot of attention to what the planet means, like universally or naturally.
Oh, okay.
But in horary, you're really...
This is just the role and that time. So, they can be naturally a flower-throwing Libra like that. But actually, they're Saturn in this situation.
Yeah, and that doesn't necessarily mean that. Yeah, and just because you're signified by Saturn, or say you're asking a question about a romantic interest and that person is signified by Saturn, that doesn't mean that they're a very Saturnian person necessarily at all. It just means that for this chart, they're Saturn, you know? Like it doesn't get much more complex than that. Having said that, like there are some certain instances where, like say if Saturn doesn't rule any of the houses that are important for the question, like, you know, let's keep going with a relationship example. So if Saturn doesn't rule the 1st or the 7th, but he's involved in some way, like if there's an aspect to Saturn, then I might start to wonder whether he does signify things like blockages or limitations or restrictions and things like that. But yeah, I'm not necessarily just looking at Saturn and going, Saturn equals bad stuff. And I think in traditional natal astrology, and especially the further back in time you go, that kind of thinking does become more and more like prevalent.
Yeah, it is a little bit more, and it's also, I think it was a little bit more literal, even if you go past the books that were written, when astrology was seen more as, you know, it was, you came from this planet, or you came from the god or goddess, and literally everything was held up within that. and included everything. So your whole life was meant to be, you know, like, and there was I remember someone telling me, and I can't remember who it was now, but it was the whole idea that if you were going to give birth at a certain time where a certain planet was rising, or so, you would be encouraged to not give birth, like to suppress it, so that you could wait until it was, you know, like, and that's, I can't imagine that you can actually hold it back that much and how much pain, but that's how important it was. That's how important it was seen. So it's very interesting to see. Now we've got questions, you know, we've got the two kind of sides of it with horary. What I had to learn when I started learning, because I read Frawley and a few other books, I had to learn a lot bit more about not so much sex, because you learn sex when you're doing traditional astrology more, but I had to learn more about essential dignitaries, because I'm not that interested in the history of astrology. I'm kind of like, does it work? Okay, and then do I need to know the history to know why it works? If not, don't need it. But I'm always first, is it works? But then when you are doing things like mundane, or you're doing horary, you kind of need to know the condition of the planets, because it does tell you a bigger story. You know, like, you know, we talked briefly about Venus I mentioned Venus in Scorpio. It's not a happy place for Venus. Doesn't mean that Venus is bad, but Venus isn't her lovely, you know, like, she's not expressing herself in the way that she would like to. And you can see that in the dignitaries. Whereas actually, that's where I started to learn it. I'm still not very good at it. But from basic level, it's in its opposite side. It's not doing very well. And sometimes you can eyeball the chart and kind of just go, oh, that's probably just a no. And there'll be certain times because I was doing it and I was trying to learn. I still can't learn it, but I was then doing, you know, I'd make a note, because you can't always just pull out the chart, especially if you're in your day job. You can't say, hang on a second, you have to make a note 10:40, and then you look it up, and sometimes you find it's the same ascendant over and over, and sometimes like, okay, that is to do with that house. So I might not be able to read the whole thing, but I can take that ascendant and go, okay, I know what's really troubling me or on my mind so much. So when your clients come to you, do they really just want the answer? So if you said to them, do you write out kind of, it's a no, but this is the reason why, do they ever come back with questions on, so I'm assuming you don't do this face to face, do you, or is it?
I think, well, mainly my horary work is done in writing through email and things. I think because horary lends itself to that more than other types of astrology, I'm interested in, once the site is up and running, to offer people like maybe a 30-minute consult after I've sent them the written reading, so that I can talk through it with them and things like that, or potentially do the 30-minute first. That might be smarter, and then send the writing second, so there's no opportunity for them to like misunderstand it and you know.
No, I mean, it's just interesting. I just wonder how, because sometimes people just want the end result, and sometimes it's the story. So with horary, it seems to be very end result orientated. So you know, where is my dog? Where is this? What's happened to it? So it's very end result, but then there is this backstory. So I wonder how many people really listen to the backstory, or whether they are just kind of like, oh, okay, well, it said no, or it said yes. Because I guess if it's yes, you would want to know why. But I do wonder whether when it says no, people, especially in relationship ones, whether they actually take that on board, or whether they just go, you know, like, oh, is he interested in me? Because how do you, when you're asking a question which seems quite subjective, but in her, you can see it by the planets of how they are aspected to each other. So I think that's the one thing that I guess horary does in a very black and white fashion. It kind of says, yeah or no, he likes himself. Like he's not so interested in it. And then you probably find it's the barrister that they've meant once or twice. Do you ever find that the answer of what they've told you and the answer that you've got doesn't marry? Like, yeah,
sometimes it does happen. You know, like they'll describe a situation, like they might describe a person's motive, what they think a person's motivations are, or something to that effect. And then you look at the chart, and from just looking at the dignities, it seems that that person's interests are like the opposite of what the querent, that's the technical term for the person asking the question. It's quite different to what the querent is actually thinking. And then you have a question of like, well, what actually is happening here is, what it appears to be is this. That can be kind of sometimes pretty jarring. But for the most part, actually, I found that when you give someone information that you're expecting them not to reject, they actually take it on board pretty well most of the time. And it actually might confirm something that they've had in the back of their mind that they didn't necessarily tell you up front. But then when you tell them, oh, actually, this bloke, he looks like he's more interested in his career than in you, or something like that, they'll be like, oh, yeah, I thought that might be the case. So I've had to overcome my fear about telling people things that contradict what they've said to me, and just trust that the astrology is right.
I think anyone who does that has had to. I mean, I think everyone who's done any divination at all, any kind of art like this, like tarot, mediumship, psychic work, you do have to get used to kind of telling people not what they want to hear. But I do think people do say that. Whereas I guess horary, there's less wiggle room,
Yes.
Whereas in cards, people can read into them what they want. But it's a very similar question that they have over and over again. The similar question is always like, okay, well, what do I, how do I turn this around so it sounds good for me? Which is possibly the astrologers, the tarot readers, the mediums, they're all the ones who do it to themselves. They're probably the worst culprits, because they're the ones, I've known it, where someone will read something differently, or they'll just take another pack out. Oh, I tried different cards, and the same cards are coming out, and they throw another deck. So it's a standard thing, I think, very much that we can be our own worst enemies when you know it. But how do you use horary in your life? So what was the last time that you looked at something with horary, and what type of questions are you asking, and do you approach it in a very similar way? Yeah, just in your everyday life, do you use it to, if you lost something, would you look at it, or do you use it as a tool for yourself as well as doing readings for others?
It's funny. I think when I started out, I was doing a lot of my own questions, but I think that's because I just desperately needed practice. And and Frawley's books, because Frawley is such a big influence on me, he said, just ask questions about everything, like silly stuff, like what's going to happen on this TV show that I like, and things like that, just to give you used to looking at charts, over time. Funny enough,
there's two, just a quick one of that, because Frawley says that, and then lots of other people go, only do it on what you actually care about. So there's like this, it's kind of quick, but actually how are you meant to learn, because you don't always care about everything? So yeah, sorry, exactly right. Because it makes more sense to kind of try it on all these different things, Sorry, go ahead. I interrupted.
No, you're right. It's a good point, actually. I mean, we can have a whole conversation about that, but I mean, bottom line, I and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where you were sort of saying, some of these rules about horary are a bit weird, like, oh, you can't ask a question now, it's too late, or it's too early. And I kind of take the view that that's I just think that's conceptually can't be right, because astrology, and this is, again, I'm just quoting from Frawley here, so all credit goes to Frawley. But he says, astrology works 24/7. It doesn't just turn. The astrology switch doesn't just get flicked off every now and then, like when it's 28, 29 degrees rising.
Yeah, I turn it off. It's not interested. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's crazy to say that you can't read a chart because it's a late ascendant. But anyway, I'm getting off topic here. How I use it in my life has changed a lot. I used to use it for all sorts of things, and I was very interested for a long time there. Pre-Saturn return, Rob was very interested in casting a lot of seventh house charts for any girl I met. It was just like, okay.
Yeah, I met her in the coffee shop. Let me see what she likes me.
Like almost literally like that, yeah. But these days, I use it very rarely, actually. And I think that's a process I've gone through of recognizing that in some ways, and I note that I'm speaking to someone who does divination, professionally and I do it myself. So I don't want to sort of shoot myself in the foot by saying this, but there are some times where it is good to not know and to just trust a bit.
I am completely funny enough, I was talking to Sam Reynolds, who's also met on Twitter, and I'm very much of the school, especially in relationships, is like, don't look at their charts unless you need to make a decision. Do not look at their chart, because I think that we are the worst at pulling stuff out, like and a lot of the time we just need to not know, because we'll read lots of things in. So I think it's very good, and I think the more you do, I think everyone reaches a plateau where they actually get to a point where they do it, you know, like when you're learning anything, you do it all the time for every answer, and then you reach a point where you're like, actually no, I'll do it when I need to. You know, you don't carry your cards around, you don't do that all the time. And I think that's a maturity that you have within the process of learning, where you don't need to rely on it. You don't need to kind of like, let me check this before I do this, let me check that before you do that, because you move beyond it a little bit. You know,
it's funny.
It serves its purpose for learning, and then you get kind of a little bit saturated with it, and then you have to step back. So it kind of makes sense that you're in that evolution of going, okay, well, I can meet someone and not know exactly what their birth chart is, or I can meet them and I don't need to do a horary to see that, because you know, if not, you can be asking quite a lot about things that don't really matter, and you realize that things have to unfold. So I think that's a very important point that people need to understand, that there is that moment where you dip slightly, and you dip into it and dip out of it. And especially if you're doing other people's charts and things like that, you don't have always the capacity to look at yours. If you're knee deep in other people's charts, I bet you just don't always want to go, oh, what shall I, you know, what do I need to look at this? But do you look at your transit on a level of, I'm not going to go into transits, but I just wondered whether, do you look at your transits on a daily, monthly, yearly?
I look at my birth chart, and I do predictive work using my birth chart, but I am looking more at bigger picture stuff. So I tend not to drill down much further than, like, say, years, you know, like I'm interested in my perfections. I'm watching my perfections. I'm watching, like slower transits of outer planet, like, so Jupiter and Saturn transits particularly, I find, like, just really,
you're Saturn really heavy, kind of makes sense. That Saturn's going to be in there somewhere.
Absolutely. So I do that, and Fedaria and other, like, predictive techniques, but these are, like, big, we're talking, like, sort of the smallest time unit I'm working with is like a year. So I'm not really drilling down too much.
No, I'm just curious. I'm always curious about how people use it, because I don't really like looking 6 months in advance, and things will creep up. So someone will go, oh yeah, you've got Neptune's going Neptune, but they would have told me last year, and I'd go, yeah. And I like to see repeating patterns. So I kind of look at it from, I can feel the moon transits, I don't need to do that. But then I'll look, and I'm quite sporadic at looking at it. If I want to know something, I look it up, or something will come up and I go, oh, Jupiter, like, why did I not realize Jupiter's Sag is going to trine all my, because I don't look at trines. I'm not that interested. They happen, but I'm not that interested in them happening. I'm more interested in things that are going to bring events or certain things. So I kind of ignore and look at kind of hard aspects and ones that are within a certain period of time. But I do, if it's like 6 months or a year down it, I just kind of like glaze over. But I love perfections in that it gives you a slice of time. So I'm kind of fairly new in that. I think that I'm probably going to draw it to a close now. Okay. I mean, we could go off and really, it's a really big subject, and it's been a pleasure chatting to you. Hopefully we'll get you on again to talk some more, maybe nearer when your website is being launched as well. So it would be kind of have some examples of some of the other work that you're doing. And I'd really like to get into it'd be very interesting to talk about some more energetic ways of playing with the chart and stuff like that from your beginnings with the grimoires. So, but it's been a pleasure chatting to you. So I know that you haven't got your website up and running now, but where could people contact you if they wanted
to find out about my work? So currently I'm not taking readings because I'm very focused on getting the site running. But if you want to check out, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Old School Astro. I'm also on Facebook under just my name, Robert Bailey. So you can hopefully find me there. There's probably a million Robert Baileys, including one guy who won like $100 million in the US recently. So
you're not that one. Oh, darn it.
No, definitely not.
I will also put your details up. So I'll get make sure that that's in the synopsis when I actually sort out the recording of the podcast. So I just wanted to say thank you, because it's been really, I mean, we could have chatted about so many other things as well. So it's really, why's my alarm to get up on? But it was just really because I like the way that you're talking about things that are very, they kind of feel a bit remote, but you're talking about them in a very down to earth manner. And I think people, especially astrology, needs that, when you don't actually have to kind of always talk about the symbols, you talk about it in a real life setting. So it's been a pleasure to speak to you, and hopefully we get you on again.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. I'm gonna